I'm very pleased to introduce Naomi Wolf to you. It is an occasion, it is her third book, but also we are going to talk about differences in American and European feminisms, and maybe differences in, you call it third wave, in Europe we call it the seventh wave, and we can talk if your wave is actually a new wave or the old wave in disguise, but that's going to be part of the discussion. I'm also very pleased because when we are really honest about how the Dutch women movement started, we took a lot of inspiration from American feminists like Kate Millett, Shulamith Firestone. If somebody here knows who she is, you do probably. Betty Friedan and many others. More than, to be honest, from Simone de Beauvoir, who probably lived too close to us to see her as somebody who gave us something new, but we can also disagree about that. And my question for maybe 15 years was, is there going to be a next generation and what are they going to do? Because, of course, we were not just doing this women's movement for our own. We really wanted to see what was going to happen. And for a long time I had the feeling it's not going to happen. There's not going to be a new generation. And I have a little private theory that sometimes movements skip generations. I can see that both my grandmothers were much more emancipated or stronger women or angrier women or more active women than my mother had been. So I thought maybe we should wait not for the daughters but for the granddaughters. And then, surprise, from the United States again, there came several names who in themselves are the next generation but very different. And we can talk about that in the discussion. There is Kate Royfi, we can talk about is she a feminist, and we can talk about Susan Faludi, but we can certainly talk about Naomi Wolf. And her first book, The Beauty Myth, was received very well in Holland. I was very happy with it. The theme in itself was not so new. We were always already thinking about how women are looked at and perceive themselves, but the facts that she collected are really frightening, and I think this theme is still going on. We thought we had been liberated from a lot of nonsense about how women were supposed to look. We can see when we look at women's magazines that the models in it become more anorectic and younger every year. There is more money put into plastic surgery, and it seems to be almost indecent to show your age as soon as you're over 15. The second book, Fire with Fire, is something that I would have loved to have an opportunity to talk with her about because it raised a lot of controversy in the Netherlands as well. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit also later in the discussion, when she proposed that the new feminism should be called power feminism versus the old victim feminism. And there maybe we agree about some things and maybe we disagree about some things. Anyway, I agree wholeheartedly with her idea that when we should be anti-sexist and not anti-male. But I think most Dutch feminists have said that, and only the media said we didn't. So there is a talk about what would be the new strategy for this new wave of feminism. And I think we could talk about what are the problems. Is it really true that women could have the power if only they would take it? And I read in her new book, for instance, about teenage mothers of whom 80% end in poverty. And I think, well, do they really have that sort of power? Her new book is called Promiscuities, which is a wonderful title. And I hope she will explain it to us because it has different meanings. In Dutch it's called verwarrende tijden, which is confusing times. I much prefer the promiscuities. And it is a wonderful mixture of autobiography, facts, history, and interviews with women of her generation. Sometimes it's very funny, but it's always also very informative. For instance, for those who have not read it yet, it has in it the history of the clitoris. I can tell you now that, which I didn't know as a European feminist, that the clitoris was discovered in 1559 in Venice. It became suspect in 1886, celebrated in 1896, disappeared, was rediscovered, disappeared again, and was rediscovered. It is very funny because it's funny as well as actually true. Naomi Wolf is exactly as old as my son is, and she writes about the sexual pioneers, the sort of women who wrote books like Our Bodies, Ourselves, and she writes as if she had been there. She writes about part of my history. So the interesting question is, and that is something that she will answer, what have we gained when we look about sexuality and women's sexuality, and what maybe have we lost? What have we lost? Because Naomi Wolf has different parents than I had. She has parents like me. And what do you do when you want to be rebellious, like everybody wants to do, and you can't because your parents trust you completely and they have already done anything shocking that you would like to do. And that is also a very funny part, and also, no, not just funny, but also true. And what is lost when sexuality is no longer dangerous and forbidden, and you can't shock anybody with it anymore? And that's also a part that belongs to a new generation. Although she also writes in one of her last chapters that it was in part a freedom between the invention of the pill and when we were faced with AIDS, which changes a lot of things. For me, the question would be to find out what we have in common and where we have interesting and maybe inspiring differences between feminists from different generations, but also feminisms that come from different parts of the world. So let's listen to Naomi Wolf.
Thank you very much. It's a tremendous honor for me to be here, and I want to thank Anne Wertheim and all of her colleagues at the John Adams Institute who, through many rigors, brought me to Amsterdam, which is my ideal, beloved city. And I also I want to thank my publishers, and I particularly want to thank Anja, who I think we'll discover in the second half of this discussion is a living embodiment of the fact that feminism never dies and is reborn. Feminism is a tradition that's always vibrant, always living, always changing from generation to generation, and the differences enrich the similarities. I'm going to turn on this piece of phallic technology because I'm a pacer. Can you all hear me? Is it on? Is it happening? Okay. Promiscuities is a coming-of-age story for girls. It's a sexual coming-of-age story for girls, and those stories are not often told in my experience. It's my sexual coming-of-age story, and that of the young women that I grew up with in San Francisco in, as Anja said, that brief moment between the pill and AIDS. And a lot of what I talk about in the book, see, I'm a pacer, I'm going to do an Oprah. A lot of what I talk about in the book is embodied in the title, Promiscuities. And for those of you who are very familiar with English, you know the double meanings that are inherent in the word promiscuous. Who is called promiscuous? Gay men are called promiscuous. Women are called promiscuous. Straight men are called fun-loving. So embedded in the very nature of the terms with which we hear as women our sexuality described is a judgment about our sexuality being always in danger of being excessive, extreme, inadmissible. I wanted to write this book in a very unladylike voice, which is what I call the first person sexual, owning my own sexual history and telling the stories of my friends' sexual histories. And I wanted to do it for a number of reasons that way. One has to do with the nature of the secrets that those of us who came of age as young women after the sexual revolution, the nature of the secrets we're expected to keep. When we look back at our sexual coming of age, those of us born after 1960, just about all of us has experiences that are intense, sometimes ecstatic, sometimes terrifying, that we only talk about to our most intimate friends. These can range from the intensity, the mere fact of the intensity of our sexual desire at 12, at 13. And the fact that we're not even supposed to acknowledge the intensity of our desire, you can even see it, at least in the United States, in the materials in sex ed classes that boys and girls get. In sex ed classes in my country, boys' desire is part of the curriculum. Erection, ejaculation, wet dreams, it's all out there. It's, you know, as we say idiomatically, it's on the table. Fortunately, not literally. But, but girls' desire in the same classrooms is scarcely mentioned. Girls are expected to focus on really exciting subjects like menstruation and, you know, luteinizing hormone, that seductive concept. Meanwhile, their bodies and their minds are surging with the same intense, overwhelming feelings as those of boys, but there is no cultural space for that acknowledgement. Secrets like the violence, sexual violence, which is a very frequent, very common experience coming of age, always, but especially these days. And I tell the story in Promiscuities of my own brush with different kinds of violence and how normal that was, how common. Secrets like the prevalence of older men making sexual passes at teenage girls long before they're ready, now that the adult-child barriers have collapsed in the wake of the sexual revolution. Many of us have memories of the inappropriate adult sort of encroachment on us and how confusing that was. Secrets like who we were in love with at 13 and 14. And if we're honest, if we look back, if we visualize who it was we were fantasizing about and flirting with and dreaming about and making plans with, it was probably our best girlfriend. And the acknowledgement that those intense same-sex feelings are so common and so natural, a part of our sexuality, before we learn from the culture that that's just not allowed, or that the penalties for staying there are so intense that we should give those feelings up or repress them if we can. That's a secret that we keep with us. Secrets like the effect of pornography on very young girls, which again has not been addressed yet, as it can't be, by those who don't know what it's like to have your sexual identity formed when you're 8 or 9 or 10 by seeing the kinds of graphic sexual images that simply were unavailable to children before the widespread proliferation of pornography in the early 70s. And secrets like how common it is when you're 16, 17, to want to test drive your femininity the way you want to test drive a car, for instance, and to maybe put on that short skirt, or maybe accept that guy's drink, get on that guy's motorcycle. Find yourself in situations that you can't control and blame yourself for it. How very common those secrets are in our backgrounds. I know that as I'm speaking, memories, episodes, names, faces are surfacing for many of us. So what I wanted to show is that simply by telling the truth about a handful of young women's lives, those who came of age after the sexual revolution, all you have to do is drop a plumb line down into a random young woman's life, and you'll bring it up with these extremes of experience, extremes of pleasure, extremes of danger that we are asked to keep silent about and not integrate into our public or our adult personas. Now, we can ask, why bother to integrate these experiences, these parts of ourselves, into our consciousness? And this brings me to the second reason I wanted to write this book this way. Even in the wake of the sexual revolution, bad girls are still punished. We are still faced with having our sexual histories used against us to our detriment. In my country, it's probably worse than, considerably worse than it is in Holland, but we can talk about where it still lingers, this kind of punishment. Right now, for instance, Paula Jones, a woman who accused the most powerful man on the planet of a serious sexual transgression, has a retinue of lawyers who are combing through her sexual history, interviewing her sex partners, interviewing her one-night stands, so that they can make the case that she's not credible because she's been sexual, right? Anita Hill was derided when she also brought charges against a powerful man as being a bit nutty and a bit slutty. All of us know that if, God forbid, we have to face a rapist in court or even battle a divorcing husband for custody of children, that our sexuality can be brought up as evidence to undermine us and to make us powerless in those critical moments of our lives. And I wanted once and for all to create a document that said, you know what? I'm a bad girl too. You know what? If you're going to marginalize these women, you're going to have to marginalize all of us, because all of us have sexual histories that we should not have to be running away from, so that the culture will no longer be able to use women's history, women's biographies against them in such a way. And finally, I wanted to write the book this way because of a very weird development that has happened culturally in the wake of the sexual revolution, certainly in my country. In my mom's teenage years, there were good girls and bad girls did it, and good girls didn't, or did everything but. And that was clear. There were clear rules. What I find, what was true for me and my girlfriends, is that in the wake of the sexual revolution, the rules have not lifted so much as intensified in a way that's totally contradictory. In other words, on the one hand, we're expected to compete with pornography, right? Because that's like how you are like a successful, popular gal. On the other hand, you can still be called a slut. And so coming of age in the wake of the sexual revolution for girls is this incredible, impossible kind of balancing act where you try to find the safe line to walk through this minefield, this constantly shifting, contradictory set of expectations. How do I compete with pornography and not be a slut? And so I wanted to tell what it was like, what this so kind of oppressive new development is in the culture, in which rather than having a sexual revolution that said, your sexuality is yours and you can own it, it said live up to these two completely contradictory ideals. And I wanted to show just what that meant, just what that looked like in real life. And so I went back to one of my earliest memories of where I learned what the culture was telling me about how to be appropriately sexual. And I'm going to read to you briefly from a very funny, to me, very funny scene, which I'm sure a lot of you my age will recognize, because I know you had The Sensuous Woman translated into Dutch as well. And this was like a big text in my growing up. And in this scene, my girlfriends and I are sitting around in my friend Sherry's room, and we are trying to figure out how to perform the perfect act of oral sex. We're 14. And we're intent on learning, what this skill involves, because we've gotten it from the culture that this is how you become a popular, successful teenage girl. It's like a hostess skill, that we're supposed to perfect. So here we are. And remember, we're 14 years old in this scene. A lot of explicit popular sex guides were lying around the houses where we hung out and babysat, week after week in Shari's room, which she had hung with almost life-size posters of a bare-chested, glistening Mick Jagger. We read out loud from the pop sex manuals of the time. We mused over the little information that we had, refining it, examining it anew in the light of our new experiences, which each of us contributed, like poker players, to the pot of shared knowledge. All right, penis mouth technique, Shari would read from The Sensuous Woman in a mock professorial tone, crossing her legs with exaggerated fastidiousness, her face a parody of hauteur. Bend over, she read, and take the penis and place it gently in the palm of your hand. Now run your tongue. Okay, now this is where you do that flick thing. To drive him straight to ecstasy, she read, take your tongue and flick it lightly back and forth. Kath and I screamed in unison. Oh my God, we said. Now that's really romantic, said Kath. Jeez. You're extremely mature about human sexuality, sneered Shari. I'm sure your partner is going to feel totally understood. Now, she said, reading again, run your tongue down the base of the penis and back up again a few times, and then return to the butterfly flick. She continued, always keep your nails short. And try to practice relaxing your mouth muscles by letting your jaw hang slack. I read that you can do this, she said, while watching TV or driving. None of us drove yet. We're all going to be out on the freeways looking like we've had lobotomies, I thought. Now, stretch your mouth until it comes over the tops of both rows of your teeth, said Shari. How exactly do you cover your teeth with your lips? Kath could not help asking. Look, said Shari, and she stretched her lips in an odd-looking grimace. Like that. That doesn't look very sexy, I said. You look like a tortoise. No, I know, but look, she said again, and she rummaged in the bathroom and came out holding a stick of Love's Baby Soft cologne. Now, was there Love's Baby Soft cologne in Holland in the 70s? No. It's a grooming product. It's a deodorant. And those of you who were adolescents in 1976 may recall that a bunch of marketing people evidently had the brilliant insight that teenage girls were interested in phallic-shaped objects that were about 6 inches long. And so there were all these, perfumes and deodorants and body lotions suddenly, this shape on the shelves, and this was one of them. It had a domed plastic top. Here, see? She pretended to put the tube in her mouth, almost down to her tonsils. No teeth, she said. They'll love it. We shrieked again. No way, I said. Never. Oh, you too, she said. Get over it. And of course, we did get over it. Within a year, we were obsessed. Not so much with what penises did. That's how we thought of them. Separate beings. Willful third parties. Often more interesting than were the boys who had the custodial role. For that was still quite new, and we were tentative and clumsy. But rather with what they were, the improbability of them, the beautiful weirdness, the way they oddly rose of their own volition and oddly defied gravity, their unfathomable responsiveness. We could have taken it more calmly if men's penises did all these elaborate things once or twice a year, perhaps with the change of the seasons. But each time, it seemed awfully operatic. Penises were exciting. They were cool. Kath and Shari and I almost felt as if the ones we were beginning to encounter, if only through denim, as we tumbled around with our boyfriends, were our responsibility, like babies or pets. They were certainly represented to us as being our responsibility. They had lives of their own, so suddenly it was as if we too, in connection with them, had new and amazing and secret lives separate from our old, familiar ones. So that, see, all the men are like, oh, that's what the girls were thinking in 8th grade. That is a rather nostalgic and sort of jolly look back at early female sexual curiosity in the height of the sexual revolution, and how we were learning to compete with pornography as a way to come to know that we were successfully female. But at the same time, and I won't read you this chapter, I have a chapter called Sluts, in which I tell the story of a friend of mine who was identified in 8th grade as the class slut for no more profound reason than that she grew breasts before any of the other girls did. And it wasn't even that had her so stigmatized. It was that she refused to do the good girl slouch, you know, where you cover them over with a binder in school, like this, and hunch. She was a dancer, and she came from a poor family, and her parents were alcoholics, and there was a lot of turmoil in her home. As a consequence, because she had so much at home that she knew she was supposed to be ashamed of, she needed to walk tall. And because she needed to walk tall, and because she was trying to learn how to be a dancer and was imagining her audience that was waiting for her in her life, in her future triumphs and successes, and she was imagining the fine filament of her talent holding her upright, because she didn't slouch and because she had big breasts in 8th grade, our society of pre-adolescence had no visual vocabulary in which to categorize a poor girl with big breasts walking tall, except slut. And she was so marginalized by this name coming down on her that not only did her other peers treat her differently and as if she was less as a consequence, but in spite of her intelligence and her talent and her ambition, the teachers began treating her differently, and their expectations for her were lowered. And so in 8th grade, even though her sexual experience was no different than that of the nice middle-class girls that she was up against, she got identified as the slut in a way that set her life on a lesser course, in a way that I don't think she ever got over. And I know that our friendship didn't survive that, because I was aware, even in 8th grade, that although we were best friends, what was happening to her was so frightening, and I knew that it rubbed off. And when I was 14, I was not strong enough. I didn't have the integrity to say, I'll just stand here with my best friend, slut girl, and I'll just be in danger with her too. And so we were moved inexorably apart. And I know when I tell this story, names and faces come to many of you, because we all knew when we were 14 who the sluts were and what happened to them. And we learned then, as girls coming of age, to project our sexual feelings, our sexuality, onto other girls so that they will get whatever punishment is coming, so we'll be safe. These are the darker questions that Promiscuities raises, but I also was happy to discover in my research that a final question I wanted to ask brought many sort of more exhilarating answers. And this is the question of how to understand the fact that in the middle of what was called sexual revolution, in which women's libido was supposed to be once and for all freed from generations of silence and ignorance, in a time of all kinds of, language and rhetoric about female sexuality, we were growing up with laboring under three big myths about the very nature of female sexuality and desire. I mean, I thought I was pretty well informed sexually. I read Cosmo. It's a joke. But I thought I was, pretty basically informed, and it wasn't until I did the research that I did in Promiscuities that I discovered what huge whopping lies had been taught to me too about the nature of my own desire. Big whopping myth number one. Anja mentioned it in her introduction. We grew up believing that the clitoris was discovered in 1976, by sheer height. Or as one woman said, by sheer luck. And it's true. Those of you who were sentient in 1976, at least in America, there were practically banner headlines, 4-point type. The clitoris is discovered, and it was represented to us as being this tremendous technological breakthrough, like 8-track tapes or something, like penicillin. And it was also represented as this incredible gift to our generation, like we really squeaked in under the wire. We practically were looking at each other going, phew, God, that was a close call. As if our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers had been sort of struggling in ignorance for millennia. Little did I know until I did the research for Promiscuities that, in fact, as Anja said, the clitoris was first identified in 1559 in the West, believe it or not, by a guy named Columbus. It's true. As one woman joked, he was looking for India. And Anja briefly touched on this, but I'll just fill in some of the rather hilarious and yet rather poignant story of the clitoris. I call it the history of the clitoris lost and found. Because, in fact, it was sort of misplaced and recovered over and over in the course of recent history. And listen to the kinds of things that have been forgotten for us that are really useful to know. So Ronaldus Columbus identified it and rather endearingly said that it should be called the love or sweetness of Venus. In 1671, Jane Sharp pointed out, you can imagine her being this proto-feminist, she was a midwife actually, that if those parts of the pudendum had not been supplied with such delightful sensation of pleasure and of such great love, no woman would be willing to undertake for herself such a troublesome pregnancy of 9 months. So she's like, it's nature's reward for a job well done. So everyone knew where it was right up until the 19th century, which is what I call the Great Forgetting, when for the very first time, the idea that nice women are sexually anesthetic, that began to be circulated. And this was a brand new concept because throughout history, including in all the cultures that I looked at, unlike the belief that we have that men are the raging engines of lust and that women's desire is, women are more interested in cuddling and shopping, which is the myth that we were raised with, every other culture has taken for granted that women are the carnal sex. And this was understood without question until the 19th century. As Islam says, women have 9 parts of desire. And in fact, my research found that it's true that we really are what patriarchy has always feared. We really are demon goddesses of lust. And yet this was forgotten in the 19th century when the ideology we inherit became pervasive. And yet And yet it was rediscovered again in 1910 and again in 1918 when Dr. Marie Stopes published a huge bestseller. And listen to how brilliantly Dr. Stopes advises bridegrooms. She says, "A man does not woo and win a woman once for all when he marries her. He must woo her before every separate act of coitus. He must himself rouse, charm, and stimulate her." She said, it sounds like a great cocktail party. "So complex, so profound are woman's sex instincts that in rousing them, the man is rousing her whole body and soul. And," she said, "this takes time. More time indeed," she wrote, "than a husband dreams of spending upon it." So contrast this with our presumably liberated view of how heterosexuality should be paced. I mean, it's represented that, in our culture, that men's sexual response is like this Bugatti, just and that's, the way it should be, and that women are like slow and creaky, like an old Model T, and that a really nice guy will like really, really, work to really get things going. This paradigm leaves a lot of women feeling kind of like the clock is ticking, in those intimate moments. How different were those cultures that really understood female desire and sexuality, that oriented the entire sex act around women's slower response and said, this is the pacing that should obtain and makes everyone happy. Then again, in 1926, Theodore van de Velde, I believe a Dutch gynecologist, Holland is always ahead, published Ideal Marriage, which was also really wise and sensible, in which he points out that the sensations caused by stimulation of the vagina are distinct from those due to stimulation of the clitoris. In both cases, there's pleasure, but the sensations differ as much between themselves as the flavor and aroma of two fine kinds of wine, or the chromatic glories and subtleties of two quite separate color schemes. He said, I love this house and garden approach. And he said, perfect coitus would give the woman a blend of both types of sensation. Such a blend would involve supreme pleasure. Now, van de Velde, very fascinatingly, advised bridegrooms, he highly recommended what he called the genital kiss, but he advised that men should bestow it more often than women, because women's tempo is slower. And listen to the language he uses. He says, the man must, quote, exercise the greatest gentleness, the most delicate reverence in a kiss which should consist of, quote, gentle and soothing caresses with lip and tongue. Sounds like a spa vacation. So again, really an extraordinarily sensitive and attentive response to female sexuality. And this is the last quote I'll read, yet that good advice was lost again so thoroughly that in 1930, a British gynecologist, Helena Wright, had to write another book in which she said to women, go into a room, take a good light and a mirror, sit down, find your clitoris. She said, arrange a good light, you'll find a small, smooth, rounded body. She promised that, quote, the instant the clitoris is touched, a peculiar and characteristic sensation is experienced, which is different in essence from touches anywhere else. She said every woman has her own pattern of what she called rhythmic friction, and if her reader finds her own rhythm, well, the good doctor concluded somewhat abruptly, the sensation cannot be described in words. So here we have the history of the clitoris lost and found before 1976, when Sheer Heights' second wave bestseller gave women exactly the same advice. Go into a room, take a good light and a mirror, and our bodies ourselves too. But as if with this clarion call of the radically new, the sweeping away of this great curtain of ignorance. We did not know in the second wave in the 70s when we were sitting there on the floor with our good light and a mirror. Here we are with our good light and a mirror again, just like Grandma's generation. Now, what's going on culturally when something as basic as the location of the clitoris, an organ which, let us note, does not migrate, right? You know, when that basic information is lost and lost and lost and lost and recovered, what's going on? Clearly, the real nature of female desire is in fact so overwhelming, is in fact so subversive, that a culture that still fears women and women's power is reluctant to make it possible for there to be a strong, unbroken line of female self-knowledge and sexual self-acceptance that goes from grandmother to mother, to daughter to granddaughter, intact. And that's what's going on with the brief history of the clitoris that I read to you. And the last point I want to make, the last myth of the several myths that I discovered, I labored under, has to do with the very nature of female sexuality itself. And let me show you exactly what I mean. And this is the famous page 188, the most Xeroxed page of the book, which has been faxed by many women to their boyfriends and lovers and handed over, noted, highlighted. We have this belief in the West, in the wake of the sexual revolution, that we're living in the most sophisticated and advanced time for female sexuality ever, right? But it's not the case. I found that other cultures have understood and honored women's sexuality in much more sophisticated ways than we do. For example, we in the West have a 4-stage model for female sexual response: arousal, plateau, climax, resolution. You know, yippee. In Han Dynasty China, which is my favorite dynasty, there was a brief shining moment in which there was a belief system called the Tao of Love, or the Tao of Sex, which taught men that men's harmony, well-being, health, and equilibrium, as well as the entire cosmic order's health and equilibrium, depended on pleasing women sexually. I think it's not coincidental that the emperor who promoted this belief system had 4 female advisors. And during the time of this belief system, an extraordinarily subtle analysis, or I should say exploration of female desire was undertaken that led to gradations so subtle that, in contrast to our 4-stage model of female sexual response, they developed a 32-stage model of female sexual response. And it makes ours seem crudely impressionistic. And they used to give bridegrooms, again, what they called pillow books that would teach bridegrooms what these subtle stages of female response were and how to recognize them, what skills to use. Because it was believed that women, when they were aroused, exuded this wonderful, beneficial yin essence, which sort of made the stars turn in the heavens and made men feel happy and healthy, made women feel happy and healthy. I would not mind living in a Western Europe or United States that had that belief system. So I'll just read to you one passage from one of these documents. And while I'm reading, I want you to note very carefully your responses. It's a very graphic passage, but see how it makes you feel. In this case, there are 10 indications of women's desire. It reads, "A man must observe and know what should be done." And I note that this, of course, is advice that many women would cheer in our own culture and time. And the milestones of female desire are demarcated in explicit terms. A, she holds the man tight with both her hands. It indicates that she wishes closer body contact. B, she raises her legs. It indicates that she wishes closer friction of her clitoris. C, she extends her abdomen. It indicates that she wishes shallower thrusts. D, her thighs are moving. It indicates that she is greatly pleased. E, she uses her feet to pull the man. It indicates that she wishes deeper thrusts. F, she crosses her legs over his back. It indicates that she is anxious for more. G, she is shaking from side to side. It indicates that she wishes deep thrusts on both the left and the right. H, she lifts her body, pressing him. It indicates that she is enjoying it extremely. I, she relaxes her body. It indicates that the body and limbs are, I love this word, pacified. J, and now I wish I had a choir behind me bursting into song. J, her vulva is flooding, her tide of yin has come. The man can see for himself that the woman is happy. Feel free to cheer. So let's just note the difference that we've just experienced from what we often experience. It was not until I did this talk in mixed sex audiences that I had in my life the experience I've just shared now with you, which is to be in a public space with men and women seated together, and the subject that we were all looking at was a graphic depiction of female sexuality. And it wasn't until I read this passage in this setting that that experience would make me feel kind of happy, the way many of us probably right now feel kind of cheerful, right? A little song in our heart, kind of perky, right? As opposed to the usual way we feel in a mixed sex audience, very often when female sexuality is held up graphically for our examination, that usual set of feelings of fascination, anxiety, curiosity, discomfort, attraction, offendedness, or a vague sense of threat. And what I obviously am calling your attention to is that it is the cultural frame that makes the difference. And the cultural frame around what I just read to you was reverence for female sexuality, respect and love. And what I'm asking us to notice is that even in a world, I mean, I walked around the streets of Holland. They're very much like the streets of Times Square in New York. The streets of Amsterdam, certain streets in the sort of sex industry district. And I saw a lot of vulvas, you know, but I didn't see freedom necessarily because I didn't see reverence and I didn't see love. And I want you to just for a moment look back at when you were 11 and remember the first time you walked past a construction site and you heard words like, you know, pussy, cunt, whatever it was. And remember how ugly those words were because they had no love in them and they had some hostility in them. And remember that feeling of a little stain from the anger in those words going down into you. And you thought, is this what my sex is? Is this what my sex is? Now, let me note to you that in first century China, the words that were used to describe women's genitals were words that connoted preciousness, fragrance, and beauty. Open peony blossom, golden lotus, jade gate, cinnabar cleft. Now, this might not do it for you personally, but it's just important to note what a lot of positive value those words encode: preciousness, rareness, treasure, loveliness. Imagine what it would be like for 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old Dutch girls growing up or American girls growing up now to never hear their sexuality spoken of except in terms that connote preciousness, beauty, value, for them to own. And that's why I wrote this book, finally, because now I'm the mother of a little girl, and I want my daughter's generation not to have to work as hard as we had to look for and find positive models of female sexuality. Not to have to feel like their sexuality is something outside themselves that they need to live up to or be ashamed of, but rather that it's their treasure for them to explore, own, know, and value at their own pace, in their own time, with their own consciousness alert to it. And just to end, a mom told me after one of these talks that she overheard her 3-year-old girl talking to a little 3-year-old boy, and a little 3-year-old boy was trying to encourage her to play doctor. Them to explore, own, know, and value at their own pace, in their own time, with their own consciousness, alert to it. And just to end, a mom told me after one of these talks that she overheard her 3-year-old girl talking to a little 3-year-old boy, and a little 3-year-old boy was trying to encourage her to play doctor. And the little girl thought about it, and then she said, "No, I will not show you my treasure." And the mom said, "Yes!" I want her always to believe this is her treasure. And in the interests of our daughters always knowing that their sexuality is a treasure for them, I wrote Promiscuities. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Everybody is invited to use the microphones whenever you want to ask something or comment on what's being said. I have several questions, all about your last book, Promiscuities, and then we can see if there are also questions about your other books. First is, we would like you to tell a little bit more of how has the development of women's sexuality changed in the generations. I mean, you had a very different mother than my generation had. And of course, we hoped that our daughters would have a much freer life and a much more space to develop their sexuality. So could you, and the question is, in what way did my generation succeed in making it, well, easier is not, maybe better for you? And in what way could we conclude that maybe every generation has to make their own discoveries? Yeah. Maybe we cannot do it for somebody else.
Right. It's a wonderful question. And in fact, there's a passage in the introduction, which I won't actually try to find, but which addresses exactly that. And I think that here we are. One reason I felt the need to tell these stories has to do with history and changing times. Many women of our mother's generation told their stories of sexual coming of age in the shadows of the 50s, but their conclusions no longer fit. And here's why. I think when I look back on being 11 or 12 and looking at the material that my mother, a second wave feminist, was bringing home, and paying close attention to it, there was this tremendous, almost innocent faith, I think, that my mother's generation had in technology and sort of cultural intentions freeing everyone. Well, technology, really. I mean, the way that the pill was talked about, for example, and the way that access to abortion was talked about, and the way that finding the clitoris and finding the mechanism of female sexual response was talked about, all of these were supposed to bring about this brave new world in which if we just knew how to do it and we could mop up the consequences in newly efficient ways, we'd be free. And what's so interesting to me is that if you can have all of the material improvement or material conditions change for the better that you want, but without a raised value placed on female sexuality, you're going to just get mutating forms of grief. And let me just give you one example that I mentioned here. A classic set piece of second generation memoir, like Sylvia Plath's Bell Jar memoir, is the illegal abortion and how devastating that was. And a big turning point in second wave sexual revolution discourse was when all these women of my mother's generation came out with their illegal abortion stories. And the assumption was, you know, when abortion is legal, sex will be freed of its terrors and fears and so on. Well, it turns out that many of the most haunting stories that I came upon in Promiscuities were of legal abortions. Because without giving my mother's daughters, us, a higher sense of value about our sexuality, we were still having unconscious sex. We were still having the sex the guys wanted instead of maybe the fooling around that I give a clarion call for more petting. I think that girls would develop in a much stronger and healthier way if they got to negotiate heavy petting, mutual masturbation, cunnilingus, all those fun things, instead of intercourse being the thing that everyone does as soon as possible. And so there are all these stories of just heartbreaking 15-year-old abortions, 16-year-old abortions, 17-year-old abortions that were absolutely routine, but that even as adult women, we can barely assimilate into our consciousness, barely talk about it.
Do you think that your generation has ever been pushed into a sort of sexuality before you were ready? I think about that because of course, every generation wants to raise their children completely different and much better and avoid all the mistakes that our parents made. And I know that when my son turned 15 and when he went on vacation, I gave him condoms to take because I thought the most horrible thing that could happen is that he would have a girlfriend and his girlfriend would become pregnant. Mm-hmm. Like I had become pregnant, you see. And what happened is that I gave condoms to him when he was 16 and then I gave condoms to him when he's 17 and I said, will you please stop doing it? I have the feeling that I have to.
That's funny.
So I wonder if you could, you know, they might not be your experiences, but I have heard stories of your generation who said, you know, all these old hippies walking around naked.
Yes. It's so funny you say that. This is the classic image. I remember I was in the middle of writing a book, and we went on vacation, my family and I, to this little town on the islands off the coast of Washington State, and it was sort of an old hippie enclave. And there was this sort of really hip, like, spa with like a hot tub and, you know, under the eucalyptus trees. And here were all these old hippies naked, and there were their kids, and their kids were in the hot tub with their moms and dads, but cringing with embarrassment, and they were all wearing t-shirts in the water. You know, not a single one of these kids was frolicking around free like God, you know, intended them to be. They were all like, Mom, Dad, get your clothes on. And I do think that's understandable. I mean, one of the continual critiques in the book, I don't know how you felt about it, was the criticism that I had. Mm-hmm. I don't want to say of your generation, because that seems rather adversarial, but that in the process of my mom's generation finding themselves, the boundaries of respect of children's right to develop at their own pace without things being shoved into their faces was often collapsed. Mm-hmm. And that I do think is wrong. For example, in America there's a big discussion about pornography, but the discussion is usually cast in terms of free speech versus censorship. To me, that's completely the wrong paradigm, and that the right paradigm is adults versus children. And that adults, I believe, should have access to any kind of graphic material they want, but children should have the right to develop free of grown-up images and grown-up neuroses very often being shoved into their tiny little consciousnesses before they have a chance to develop their own sexual imagination or actually encounter another little human being, you know, in the flesh, in a context maybe even of affection. And I think that respect for children really broke down in the 60s and 70s.
Yes, it's coming. I think it is coming back because we start to realize what is happening. Well, some people anyway. When I read your book, I became aware of another sort of contradiction. You write about feminists, discovering their own genitals, using spatula. I did all that, you see.
Right on, sister.
Yes, and we wrote about it, and this is how it works, and this is what you do. The point is that there seems to be a contradiction between discovering your own body and your own sexuality and then sharing it with somebody else. For instance, a male person, which was not recommended by many feminists. No. See? Yeah. So I could see that would be a sort of confusion. Now there were all these new women with a new sexuality and they knew exactly what they wanted. But what then?
Right, right. Right. Well, you know what then. I mean.
Yes, but I think it was a contradictory message.
It was. It was. Yes. Look, I mean, I lived the controversy of that contradiction because in 89, I wrote an article in Ms. called Radical Heterosexuality, which basically said, I'm sick of inheriting this feminist discourse that if you're a real right-on sister, you can't possibly want to have intercourse with a man because you're, a victim of false consciousness and all men are rapists and, you just want to, the penis is the enemy. And as I joked, I think with my last book, sometimes after a long, hard day at work, you get home and the penis is your friend. There was no room for this kind of humor in the feminism that I inherited as a baby feminist in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And I do think we've moved on in a healthy way. I do remember the days when my mother, poor mom, wrote her doctoral dissertation on the lesbian community in San Francisco, which was great. But so her research was, I spent my childhood with my mom hanging out in, dyke bars and leather bars. And there were all these bikers at my bat mitzvah. That was a big thing. But Mom was ostracized when her book came out because she was a heterosexual. Yeah. And I do remember that moment in the mid-'70s when, you could discover all the apparatus, but there were very limited people you could direct that to. So I do think we've moved into a healthier time when I don't think younger women are as anxious about compromising their integrity as feminists by being involved in relationships with men.
Yes. Well, you write very. I recommend the book obviously because because it is through your own experience, and the experiences you write about are very different. They're not just jubilantly positive, and they're not just saying, "Oh, sadness! It's all sadness and it's all going wrong." So that's what I really like about your book. I forgot the question.
But you know what? I'm not being fair in a way. Because you asked, your first question is, what did your generation do for us? Yeah. And I didn't get a chance. First of all, one thing my generation doesn't do formally adequately enough is thank you. And so I just want to say thank you. And I mean that.
I remember my question. Yes. The thing is, you write about the development of girls, and of course, if we decide that at least it should be possible or allowed to share some of those discoveries with men, you write just sometimes about what happened with men in the meantime. And one thing that struck me is that you write about a woman your age who's trying to, what we call, lose her virginity,
right.
which is very funny to me because it's not the thing that you can drop.
How do you say that in Dutch, by the way?
Ja, ontmaagden. Ontmaagden it doesn't sound very pleasant either. And she couldn't find a man to do it because all the men she knew were these nice sons of feminists.
Right. Who didn't want to oppress her in that way.
Yes. Do you really think that there is a men have developed in like women have, or could you?
Well, I thought you were going to ask the question slightly differently. Are you asking, is there a group of men, often sons of feminists, who do actually feel guilty about their desires? And the answer to that is yes. And I know there is. And I think this has to be talked about and addressed because men, I would say heterosexual men, this isn't true for gay men, I don't think. Heterosexual men are trapped in some ways. They're the last group to be so confined within their sexual roles without any possibility of getting out. And there's been such a thorough critique of male heterosexuality that a lot of young men coming of age now feel like they can either be total pigs, you know, and like get aroused when they see nipples, you know, and there's something really, really wrong about that. And they feel guilty, actually, about it. Or else the other extreme that many men also suffer from, and a lot of young men who've come to my audiences have talked about this, of feeling like there's a parallel process in adolescence of young men learning that they have to sever the connection between their heart and their genitals, and that to become a real man, a successful heterosexual man, they're not allowed to talk about how their feelings and their sexuality are connected, or their sexual vulnerabilities. And I think that men are very aware of how this confines their own, not only emotional experience, but I would say also their sensual experience.
I think that is, I mean, there is very little, we all talk about how women can develop a sort of a sensuality, not just sexuality, but sensuality. But I think it is maybe even under the circumstances for men more difficult to find
much more
space to experiment, to find out. I mean, they don't even have books about, well, a few, but so I think a lot of young men go the direction of pornography because they're curious. And one of my biggest objections against pornography is that it makes men into bad lovers, because the whole image might be very exciting, but it's so unrealistic.
Yes. Go on.
Yeah?
What do you mean? Expand on that.
Do you agree that it is very difficult for men to find out in a different way to what sexuality could be for them? Absolutely,
I do, and I'm thinking of two things that come to mind right away. One is the movie In and Out, which has a scene where this guy who fears he's gay is trying to learn how to be a real man. It involves learning how to not dance ever. You know, that real men don't dance. And, you know, there's this scene where his body's twitching and there's Donna Summer on the tape and he's just really trying to not dance. And I think there's a parallel with sexuality, which is there's all kinds of letting go and surrender and opening and nakedness in the truest sense that I think a lot of heterosexual men don't let themselves know, yield to, feel, explore. A lot of infantile pleasure, you know, shall we say even regression, that women are allowed to explore. I mean, the pleasures of passivity, you know, among other things. I mean, I don't want to get, you know, too detailed about sort of what I like, but the point is that women are allowed theoretically to like a lot of things, a lot of, in a way, more sex roles in bed in some ways than men are allowed to like. I think a lot of men live in fear, you know, once they start a relationship, if I tell this woman what I really want, or if I am not this super stud performer, if I'm not on 100% of the time, she'll have contempt for me, I won't be a real man. And there's something, a final thing, a lot of men have said that they feel, and this is part of the pornographic ideal, that the whole work of sex is their job, like, you know, taking out the garbage is their job, you know? Like the whole work of desire, that men are supposed to do the desire for both of them. And it's true that women, you know, as I wrote in the book, are not really allowed to own, express, have their desire, because then they're, you know, scary or voracious. The corollary is that men have to do all the desire. And a lot of guys have said, you know, sometimes you get home and you just want to watch TV, you know, because it's too much, it's overwhelming. So yes, I think we're in a dance in which both of us are half of what we can be.
I remember, and then I'll get to the questions that you have already asked. I remember the first big women's congress in the Netherlands, and there was a workshop on sexuality, and we did a little research, and we asked the women, did you ever fake orgasm? 70% of the women said yes.
Oh my God.
And the other 30 said they never thought about it, but they thought it was a good idea.
No, you're joking.
I'm just joking a little bit. But the 70% is true. Do you think that still happens?
I really hope not. I mean, what I would say, what's the point? It's like going out to a restaurant and pretending to eat.
Well, it's like your remark about man who says no. It's a lot of effort. It's not just always this what you see in pornography. Everything just goes by itself. Right. You know, the effort.
Right.
So I was reminded of women who think, oh God, you know,
got to get the kids up in the morning. Right.
Let's just pretend this is it.
Right. I understand what you're saying. That does make sense, and I think that has to do with again a uniquely Western way we think about sex, and I would say actually a capitalist way that we think about sex. We think about sex as the end result. It's like we think about, you know, a Model T as what comes off the production line. You know, the end result is the orgasm. And I mean, I'm a big fan of orgasms. You know, I'm not gonna, you know, I'm not gonna say no, but it's also striking to read the Tantra, for instance, or the Kama Sutra, or some of the other practices that teach men and women to just like immerse themselves in each other and hang out. And if you actually try that, you know, just being a kind of sort of meditative sex, I guess, the kind of pleasure and intimacy and emotional connection can be so fulfilling that, but it's not quantifiable. It's not like this, it's not something Hugh Hefner could make money on. So I do think we suffer from this sort of capitalistic, commodified view of sex. Yeah.
Oh, I was a socialist feminist, so I like it that you know, a little bit criticism.
I know the C word.
Okay, there is a question about language, which you already, shall we take that one first? Because you're standing on your feet. Okay. One on language. You already said something about that it's so important that we have names for our bodies that are positive and gentle, like treasure. And there's a question about the ironic and highly common use of the word cunt, kut in Dutch. And there are different...
It does sound better in Dutch, by the way.
Kut. I don't know, not in Dutch.
No, really? Yeah.
And the funny thing is there are different languages, how we swear. And for instance, the Germans always swear anally. It's always Scheißwetter and Arschloch and things like that. And the Dutch swear genitally. It's always klote weer and kutwijf. And Freud would have a lot to say about that. And the point is, the question is really, how can we use an intensely negative modifier like cunt Yes, what should we do with language? I know that there are different experiments. I try to, in the books I wrote on sexuality, to use the words so often that you own them back.
Right, yes.
But you have maybe different.
No, I think that practice is very wise, and that's what, for instance, the word queer is doing in America when gay activists call themselves Queer Nation. But there is a problem, inevitably, which is a semiotic problem, which is that as long as we've got a culture that negatively values female sexuality, any word we use to identify female genitalia, even if we use, the gold standard to identify female genitalia, is going to become devalued with usage. So I would say the answer is not so much in finding new labels, rather in telling so many stories that we fill in the missing multiplicity about our sexual identities, so that female sexuality can't be put back in one box, so to speak.
Okay, box, yes. But it's another
in
one.
English too, I know.
Okay. There's a question.
I want to thank both ladies for the nice chat and nice conversation. My impression of the interesting conference of Naomi was that there was a lot of emphasis on socialization. So I think that socialization is very important in your self-image and self-concept and development of your own sexuality. Also generation is, but I think there are a lot of exceptions. For instance, my grandmother, I much more easily talk about sex with my mother. And I'm myself as a therapist on sexual problems. And for my own it's amazing for me that a lot of girls, young girls, early 20s, say, well, it's more easy for me to talk with my daddy about my sex or my questions with my mother. So I think there's a little bit danger in it, to do all to socialization and to do all to generation. That's first. The second thing, I think that it's very easy for us, and I'll also blame myself. It's a very nice kapstok. Wat is een kapstok met Engels?
Maak je zin even af, dan kan ik het...
It's very coat hanger. It's a very easy coat hanger to blame socialization and our mothers about our own complex. So and then, I can't quote you literally, Naomi, but somewhere in your very interesting lezing, you said something like, we finally, I can't quote you literally, but something like, finally we have to teach the man that we have a slowly tempo to get an orgasm. How do you mean? Is that your idea? With masturbation goes 2 minutes. The guys take 10 minutes or half an hour. So what is your self-perception, perhaps by socialization, that guys have to learn and we have a very slow tempo? That's
okay, all right.
It's not an attack, it's a question.
I'm not sure I understood the question, but I'm going to summarize it.
That's my third, that's just an
Wait. This is the second question?
Then are you aware, both very big shots on this field, that from the half hour that you both has a chat, that 50 minutes of it, it was to replace you in the sexual mind of guys?
Okay, let me take these one by one. First, A. All right, may I take this? Thanks. A, I don't believe everything is due to socialization, just like I don't believe everything is due to nature. And I think it's simplistic for anyone to hold that any gender issue or racial issue or cultural issue is due to one set of factors rather than a complex interplay of factors. And that's something that I'm actually very proud of in my work, that I think, unlike some feminist critics, refuse to get rid of the ambiguity. I mean, in this book, you've got women talking about, me talking about why I stayed in a relationship with a boy who beat me up, and what I got emotionally out of a relationship with a boy who beat me up. That's ambiguous. That's an acknowledgement of the ambiguity in our natures, in our sexuality, in our will. Number two. Number two was tempo. Listen, I didn't say women have a shorter tempo. I quoted past sexologists who said that women tend to have a slower tempo. Now, it certainly could be in 1926, women were having a slower tempo because of all of the cultural forces arrayed against women, speeding up, perhaps. I don't hold women should have any particular tempo or that men should have any particular tempo. I think we should go at exactly the tempo we want to, and that, we want to, it's our dance, we should dance at, 33 RPM or 45 RPM. But I think that being prescriptive is exactly what we should not be, and that some feminist criticism and a lot of sexology really fails because it's prescriptive about what people should do. And your third point, I really actually have a strong feeling about. You seem to be taking issue with the fact that Anja and I spent, I would say actually maybe a quarter to a third of the time we had talking about men. And this comes up frequently. Sometimes I'll be speaking to an auditorium, and I take a lot of pride in being very inclusive with the men in my audiences and the male readers of my books. And a woman will say, "What are you doing? Spending 10 minutes on men, or what are you doing wasting 35 seconds welcoming men?" To which I want to say, I think there is a real moral problem with identity politics that refuses to engage warmly and honoringly with the other, whether it's racial politics, ethnic politics, gender politics. I am sick of us versus them rhetoric. We are not going to solve any of the divides. Okay, let me just finish and then I'll hear you. I just want to conclude by saying I don't believe we'll solve any of the many divides we face and move into a 21st century, which I think actually is going to be a renaissance of tolerance until we learn how to invite the other lovingly into the conversation. And I think if we're worried about time running out, we need to create more and more spaces, more and more amplitude, more and more time, so we lose the sense of scarcity that we have culturally that makes us anxious about it. And just before we go on to another question, I just want to make sure that we're taking questions from everyone and that we've got enough time. Yeah. Yeah.
You misunderstood me.
Okay.
I don't mean that we are enemies, but that we still are slachtoffers.
Victims.
Victims for our own socialization, because I do the same thing. When I'm thinking what is wrong with my own sexual life, I think, well, I'm still, replacing me in his mind or her mind, So it was not that about enemies. Of course, it's very important that we communicate with guys about that. But we are still busy with how is he thinking, what is he expected. That's what I meant with it.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but I have to say, you and I can agree to disagree, because frankly, if you're heterosexual...
I don't attack you. It was just something...
Okay. We can agree to disagree. Yeah?
I have a more general question. I read the American version of your first book, and in it said that you were planning on writing the third one, but in between you wrote Fire to Fire. So I was just wondering, it seems like you're coming up with themes that are kind of floating around in society at a certain time. So I was wondering if you could tell us something about how you get an idea and how you put it into a book.
If only I knew. Well, actually, it's a good question. Beauty myth, I knew I needed to write, again, just from personal experience. I was at Yale, and I was aware that the brightest and most ambitious young women of my generation were starving themselves to death or spending a lot of time vomiting in the bathrooms. And I knew that this was draining our energy and our confidence, and I realized that it was a political problem when I studied 19th century literature and found out that there was a similar backlash against women during a similar time of foment in the 19th century. But Fire with Fire, I was really called to write. I didn't plan to, as you know, I was planning to write Promiscuities instead. But the Hill-Thomas hearings, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, intervened, and there was this kind of cultural uprising in 1993 in America where women were sort of standing up and saying, we're not going to take it anymore. And I was aware that if we didn't have a reframed feminism, that energy could run into a brick wall. And so it was like an intervention. I wrote the book really fast because I wanted to be sure that there was another way of thinking out there that was available to women to channel this renewed energy into in order to create more lasting structures than the kinds of flare-ups of the past that sometimes don't leave institutions behind them. And Promiscuities I've wanted to write since I was 15 years old, just because, you know, it's sort of the deepest story of my life, and I couldn't find it anywhere in the culture, and it's the book that I needed when I was 15.
It's nice that many writers write the books they would like to read.
Yeah.
And when you're impatient, you can wait forever for somebody to write the book that you want to read, and you can write it, and you get paid also.
Yes.
Yes, oh, it's working. Okay. Yes, I'd just like to know if you, how to say, if you just wouldn't want to get rid of the term, the word feminism, or calling you yourself a feminist. Because what I heard you say just 5 minutes ago, that pleased me very much, because I just read your book, and I loved your book, and I didn't want to get involved in a sort of framework of feminists against macho, duress, or I don't know what. I just read your book and I thought it was great because it was exploring, was explaining, was clarifying, and yeah.
So how can you be a feminist?
No, I
understand.
Yeah.
I'm teasing.
I know. No. Well, here's why I proudly hold the term feminist for myself, even though I don't at all think we need to insist on other women or men using it. I think it's a useful term historically, and here's why. When women, as most do now, believe in the goals of equality, but shun a word like feminist, then they have a lot of energy for their individual struggles, but they don't have any institutions, as I said before, or organizations to multiply their clout and to create lasting change. And then you run into burnout because you get exhausted and overwhelmed with your own personal life. But it's like calling yourself a member of the Green Party. You know, it's one thing to say, I like trees personally, but it's another thing to get it, that if you really want to protect that tree, you can't do it alone. You need a party, you need an organization, you need a philosophy that other people can join you with. Now, my feminism is very inclusive, and it invites you. So I don't see a contradiction there, because I think you and I can work together on feminist goals, which I think feminism is an interim stage, and that the goal we're working toward is a kind of human fulfillment of human potential, which is essentially spiritual, which is the recognition that, and now I'm going to use language that some people may be comfortable with, others may not, that, you know, there is a divine essence in everyone, and that it's radically equal, and that any laws or any social customs that downgrade one group of people to serve another violates this spiritual truth.
Okay. Another question?
Yes, please. I would like your comment on a situation that happened recently. I'm an American woman. I've lived here for 12 years. I have 2 Dutch daughters, and they're very Dutch, and they go to Dutch schools. I speak English and they speak Dutch. And recently in their school, one is 9, she's the older one, they took on a school-wide project of pop stars. And this was a thing that the whole school got involved in. Last year they did printed books, which I appreciated more. It was very good. This year they did pop stars. The whole school was plastered with pictures of the Spice Girls and the Backstreet Boys. And that was all right. I mean, I was a little bit critical, but okay. I don't always go to the 9-year-old's classroom, but every few days I do. And when I went to her class, on the door, as it opened and closed, there was one poster of a young woman, pop star, I don't know who she was. Unlike all the others, where it was mostly the groups and they were just these kind of funny antics, this one, she was only dressed in her brassiere and pants that were open, and her hand was in her pants like this. And when I saw that, just out of immediate reaction, I just said, "Is that one necessary?" In Dutch, you know, do we also have to have that one? The reaction, there were other mothers around and the teacher, and it had been up there for a few days, I had only just seen it. And they said, "Why not?" And I said, "Because I think that one's not a good image. You know, it's different than the others. And this one isn't the kind of image that I want my daughter to be facing every day." I went and I complained to the head of the school. They said they were going to look into it. There's vacation now, so there's only a few more days of school. They didn't take it down. Now I have to deal with the fact that I was ignored when I objected to something, that other people didn't find it a problem, and in fact I ended up having to feel, and this is what I'm like wondering about, that I was starting to feel like maybe I was making too much out of something. The dominant reaction was they see it every place. And these are 9-year-olds, and I'm thinking, what kind of image are they getting? And other people are saying, you're making an issue out of something that they haven't even thought of yet. You're making them think that there's a problem here, and that hadn't occurred to them. And I don't know what to make.
It's a bigger question. There are more questions like that. About how are our girls raised, with what sort of images? Is it the Sharon Stone crossing her legs image, or what would you feel as an American seeing all the explicit pornography in the windows in the red light district? I mean, it's variations on the same theme. What images do we want young women to grow up with?
Right. That's a really important question. First, I would say that your school, I just want to affirm you in your discomfort and, you know, you're feeling ignored, because I do think we as parents have to be much more activist in intervening in what our kids get, and your school should not have passed over your concerns. And it seems like a small enough thing to take a look at it and sort of bring some consciousness to it. Maybe a really great solution would be a discussion about, you know, among the parents, about what sort of limits there should be on what kind of images. What I would say, again, is that kids are being sexualized too young, and that it's not fair to them. And that precisely because they get it everywhere in the street, there's some places, school, home, maybe churches and synagogues, some kind of after-school places where they should be able to relax and take their time. Now, an interesting theory I have that you can set me straight on is, I have sort of held up Holland, Norway, Sweden as possible solutions to the American dilemma, but I'm not sure whether I'm right, because in America we have total puritanical censorship of useful information about sex, plus total psychotic commodification of the most violent, brutal pornography. And this leads to a lot of, you know, sickness and disease, as you can imagine. I was wondering if good information and good self-esteem about sexuality, and a more relaxed attitude about female sexuality in particular, kind of inoculated girls against what happens to them when pornography is the only way their sexuality is represented. And so I guess I would turn that question back over to the audience, because I sense that that Dutch women are much stronger and more confident about some aspects of their entitlement to feeling reasonably okay about some things about their sexuality that American women tend to be. And yet there's, it's Vulva City in the windows, and that would lead me to imagine that if you get lots of choice about ways to think about your sexuality and lots of good information, then it's just another vulva in the window.
We can hope it's like that, but my problem is also with the boys who are in a sort of unattractive age. The girls their age are more interested in boys who are older, especially in the age where they develop the sexuality. The only material for boys that is satisfying for the curiosity is sometimes very violent pornography. Yes. And I invite you to go to the ACO bookshop on the Central Station and look at the comics. And they are really cruel. They're about torture. Mm-hmm. There's no other word for it. And I wonder what happens if girls is one way of thinking, but what happens to boys when they think this is what sexuality is about at an age where they're not finding anything anywhere else?
Right. I share your concern, and I think that what we need to do is create, which is why I wish you would update your book that you put together, which is this guide to sexuality for adolescents, as I understand it, from some years ago. We need to be responsible to not just critique the culture we have, but to create new cultural forms and products. If you're going to be bombarded with Spice Girls, you've got to create, I would like to see, educational materials, and maybe this is something you as parents can talk about with your schools, that show other, rites of passage for girls, other ways girls can think about their sexuality, and boys too. And also I would leave texts from other cultures lying around the house if you've got teenagers, like pillow books, like the Kama Sutra, like Chinese engravings. Because if you've looked at this kind of erotica, it's hilarious. It's body. There are like 7-foot penises and 9-foot vaginas and people on swings and people hanging upside down. But everyone's having a great time, yes. And there's no cruelty, and it's a whole different frame around sex. So I think we need to open up our imagination rather than close it down.
That's not a question. How is it possible? But I don't know if you want to go into answer this question as a historian. How is it possible that the same country that wrote this really, really nice and exciting, it's really sensitive about female sexuality, like the part from China, the same country has been very cruel towards women in another century. So it seems, I don't know if you can answer.
No, I can't, because there's been no erotic utopia for women ever, yes. Which is why it's up to us to create one.
Yeah, okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
Okay. Does somebody have a nice last question? Yeah? Your next book.
My next book is to the speaker who asked how I get my ideas, like the classic feminist yes. tradition of looking at my life. My next book is about becoming a mother and about how motherhood is devalued and how no one tells you the truth about the very mixed feelings you're going to have.
That will be wonderful, because what you're doing for me is some steps into the future when I think of what we've done, but this idea behind this is still the same. We don't want prescriptions about how women's sexuality should be. We don't want prescriptions about how motherhood should be, but you will help other mothers and future mothers a lot by telling it how it is.
Well, thank you, and again, thank you so much for creating the world that I got to enjoy, that allowed all of our work to go on and to have created a conversation with of each
Okay.
other's work. Thank you very much.